So hi everyone, my name is Stuart Turnbull-Dugarte. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southampton. And today I'm going to be presenting a new working paper in which I look at how the legalization of same-sex marriage in some states has an effect on individual level attitudes towards homosexuality in foreign nations. So a brief overview of the project itself. The research question essentially asks, what is the cross-national effect of the expansion of LGBT plus rights in certain states? I rely on a natural experiment from Israel in which the treatment condition is a quasi-exogenous exposure to the Supreme Court of the United States ruling, which took place in 2015 that legalized same-sex marriage in the US. The results, bit of a spoiler here, show that there was a negative effect of the ruling on attitudes towards homosexuals. So essentially those individuals who were exposed to the fact that the United States had legalized same-sex marriage became less supportive of homosexuality, and the effect was much larger for the case of women. So just kind of give you now a bit of a theoretical overview and some context for those who are maybe not familiar with this literature. The legalization of same-sex marriage has been on the rise across a number of Western and post-industrial nations. So the most recent took place in 2020, which was Costa Rica. And in the EU, the most recent state was Austria, which legalized same-sex marriage also through the courts, the same path that was adopted by the US. Now, most of the literature that looks at the effects of same-sex marriage reforms on public opinion and individual level attitudes tend to come from the US and the EU, as these are the nations where a number of reforms have taken place. This literature, however, is largely focused on the domestic arena. So within the EU, we have this excellent piece by Tarek Abu-Chadi and Ryan Finnegan in CPS, in which they showed that in those states where same-sex marriage reforms are enacted, there is an increase in tolerance towards homosexuality. In the United States, the evidence is largely mixed. In some of the earlier advances within certain states like Iowa and Massachusetts, evidence points towards a backlash effect. So in those states where same-sex marriage was enacted, be it the legislature or be it the judiciary, respondents or individuals tended to become more hostile towards homosexuality. Some of the more recent evidence, however, particularly Bishon and colleagues' piece in the AGPS and Flores and Barclay's piece in Political Research Quarterly, shows that the reverse is true. In the first study, they basically find a null effect. So legalization of same-sex marriage, also they rely on a quasi-natural experiment, provides no attitudinal change, whereas Flores and Barclay show that actually there was an increase in warmth towards sexual minorities following the legalization of same-sex marriage. And the theoretical argument that Abu-Chadi and Finnegan, as well as Flores and Barclay promote, is that when states changed laws or enact public policies that bring sexual minorities out of this sort of social deviant category into the mainstream by legitimizing their relationships, this has a norm diffusing effect in which individuals are then primed to update their preferences or attitudes towards these individuals. So holding homophobic preferences becomes less palatable for individuals once same-sex marriage has been enacted. However, we also know that the expansion of same-sex marriage rights coincides with the expansion of anticipatory movements that seek to protect states from the expansion of future LGBT plus rights reforms. So this is an excellent piece by Moss, I think it's in Eastern European Politics, in which he shows that there's a strong correlation amongst European states between the expansion of same-sex marriage and constitutional reforms, which seek to define marriage between a man and a woman. The kind of argument that is behind this expansion is built the anticipatory backlash thesis, which was first penned by Weiss in 2013, in which she shows that even in those states where there is no domestic demand for reform, a number of opponents to LGBT plus rights use a rhetoric in which they frame the expansion of LGBT plus rights abroad or the transformation of international and transnational norms as a threat to their domestic way of life and then engage in these anticipatory movements that seek to defend them. This literature, however, is almost all focused on elites. So they're looking at governments in power, political parties, or other civic organizations. But there hasn't yet been a test of the anticipatory backlash thesis on mass attitudes or an individual opinion in relation to LGBT plus individuals. That's what one of the contributions that this paper seeks to make, is that it takes the theoretical arguments of the backlash thesis, but looks at mass attitudes rather than elite behavior. So we have alternative hypotheses here. The first is kind of relying on the arguments presented by Moss and Weiss, in which we can expect the legalization of same-sex marriage in the United States to decrease tolerance of homosexuality abroad, because it signals to individuals in these other states the expansion of the norm that is at odds with their heteronormative definition of marriage. But however, since we know that in the domestic state level, legalization of same-sex marriage can transform norms, which leads to an increase in support for homosexuality, the reverse hypothesis would be that the United States Supreme Court decision would increase tolerance to homosexuality abroad. These are alternatives, but of course there is a null in that, you know, individuals in states outside of the United States are basically not concerned, or their attitudes towards homosexuality are not updated in any way by decisions taken in the US. Importantly, however, we can expect gendered effects on a response to the court decision. So for those familiar with the gender literature, traditionally there was a traditional gender gap in which women were more conservative than men, and this was based on, at least according to the literature, their higher level to be socially conservative on moral issues and were more likely to be religious than their male peers. Although across a number of Western nations, modern gender gap has emerged in which women are far more liberal on socially conservative issues than their male peers. In the case of Israel, however, which is the case study we're looking at today, we expect our traditional gap to be at play because of the large role of religion in Israeli citizens' everyday lives. But essentially, our second hypothesis is that there's going to be asymmetric effects for men and women. So looking at the study itself, we basically rely on the unexpected event during survey design approach, which is detailed by Munoz and colleagues in their political analysis paper. Essentially, we are relying on the exogenous exposure to individuals regarding the news of the Supreme Court's decision, because the decision took place in the middle of survey fieldwork. The survey in question is the European Social Survey of Wave 7. So why is the US a good case to test the impact of cross-national effects of same-sex marriage reforms? Well, the important thing about the US is that the legalization of same-sex marriage came about via the courts. So this adds an increased layer of exogeneity. It's not the case that members of Congress in individual states or at the federal level were reacting to transitions in public opinion or global trends. It was the decision came about by civic action taken to the Supreme Court. Notably, the Supreme Court, at least pre-Trump, tended to decide on a 5-4 split, which added an increased layer of exogeneity, basically, because decisions can't normally be predicted. And another important feature of the United States case is that whether we like it or not, the US is a large exporter of culture. US politics tends to take a large place in the media diet of a number of member states, particularly also the case of Israel. So just to kind of lay out the land of how the natural experiment takes place, one of the important features is that we have balance across the control and treatment conditions. So to define these conditions, essentially the control group are those individuals that were interviewed for the European Social Survey before the court ruling, which was announced on the 15th of July, and the treatment group are those individuals who were interviewed immediately after the court ruling. Across a number of covariates, we have balance across the two treatment groups, so we can be confident that the differences in attitudes towards homosexuality are not the result of covariate imbalance. The main dependent variable asks to what extent do you agree or disagree with each of the 5 statements. Okay, gay men and lesbians should be free to live their life as they wish. Is running from a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. Unfortunately, there's no other question in the European Social Survey on attitudes towards sexual minorities or specifically towards same-sex marriage. So this is the best instrument we have to measure homonegative preferences. In the analysis that follows, I dichotomize this variable. This is essentially because when I run a number of placebo tests, these are all scaled on different measures, some of them 0 to 10, some 1 to 5, some are dichotomous themselves. So by dichotomizing all of them, it's easy to provide a comparison. But when I look at the untransformed variables or one ordinal logistic regression or bread and butter OLS, the effects are largely the same. So one of the important features of this unexpected event during survey design model is that we can make a claim regarding exposure to treatment because we have no measure of compliance. The estimand of interest is essentially the intent to treat effect rather than the complier average treatment effect. So what I do to measure potential exposure is to look at the Google Trends data in Israel for terms such as gay marriage, same-sex marriage, or the Supreme Court of the United States. Notably, we see that on the day of treatment and immediately after, there's a large spike in search terms. So on average, there is a greater level of interest at the point of treatment. What do the results look like themselves? So on average, we see a significant decrease in support for homosexuality in the treatment group vis-a-vis control. The predicted probability in control is about 0.68, whereas in treatment is 0.61. So 7 percentage point decrease associated with treatment here. The effects for the male subsample, however, are largely null. So men on average are not affected by the treatment condition, whereas in the case of women using the female subsample, there's a substantive negative effect of about 21 percentage points. But here I'm using a split subsample regressions, but when I use a multiplicative interaction term on the full sample, well, the same finding is replicated. I go through a number of robustness checks to make sure the theoretical argument is valid. So here I assess the effect of treatment on the number of different placebos. So we have in the top right here, support for redistribution, bottom left, support for immigration, bottom right again, satisfaction with the economy. I also run a number of additional placebos such as satisfaction with democracy in general, satisfaction with the government of the day. All of these placebos report null effects. So we can be confident that the theoretical variable of interest, which is that regarding homosexuality, is the only variable that is affected by the treatment condition, which is linked to this variable of interest. To ensure that the significant effects found are not spurious, I carry out 1,000 permutations on the full sample and also on the gendered subsamples, randomly assigning treatment date of individuals using 1,000 permutations. The vertical colored lines here indicate the observed logit coefficient, and the kernel distributions are those of the additional permutations. We see that on the full sample, the observed effect is significantly distinct from the placebo dates we model, but this is even more so the case on the female subsample. So the observed negative effect of treatment on the female subsample is significantly distinct from that of the additional permutations we model. Running an RDD approach, basically as an alternative to Munoz's and colleagues' unexpected event, where we just basically compare a simple regression model confirms our findings. So in the male sample, we have no discontinuity, whereas in the female sample, we see a significant dip in attitudes towards homosexuality in the post-treatment period as well. Contributions of the paper so far, well, it advances our understanding of the effects of LGBT rights. As we're going into more detail in the paper itself, this acts as a trigger for individuals in non-accepting states that the norms and practices that are in use in their state are under threat by the advances taking place abroad. Empirical contribution as well. We provide evidence for the first time that there's a causal impact of advances in LGBT plus rights on attitudes taking place in other states, particularly on mass attitudes or individual level behavior, opinions, because the previous literature is largely focused on acts taken by governments or individuals in parliament who are seeking to immunize themselves from LGBT plus reforms. Limitations of this paper are important. So the scope conditions are interesting in the sense that the backlash thesis only applies to states which do not already provide the same level of LGBT plus rights as that which is gauged in reform. So Israel is a state in which same-sex marriage is not the law of the land, so we can expect the anticipatory backlash thesis to hold. But if there was another state, for example, who already had same-sex marriage, we would probably expect a null effect to take place. Whilst Israel is a good case because it meets these scope conditions, it also has a particularly close relationship to the United States in that American culture is consumed on a large scale in Israel, which might not be replicated in other countries. Again, the paper is available on my website, as too is the replication code if you're interested in having a look at that, as well as some more detailed theoretical arguments, which I really had to cut into here in order to make the 12 to 15 minute time limit that was available by the conference organizers. But please get in touch if you're interested in having a read of the paper or if you have any questions in general. Thank you very much.